Okay, so welcome to this seminar today. My name is Douglas Laxton, and I'm the director of the Better Policy Project. For many, many years, I used to work at the International Monetary Fund running the economic modeling division. And before that, in the late 1980s, I was responsible for developing the flexible inflation targeting framework at the Bank of Canada. So I did this actually before I moved to the Bank of Canada. So why is that important? Well, because New Zealand, which was the very first uh, central bank in the world, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, was the very first central bank in the world to adopt inflation targeting. It did so without having any framework for thinking about monetary policy the way that we think about monetary policy today. In other words, where we think about three essential ingredients about trying to understand where the economy is today, what are the underlying forces driving the economy, and most importantly, you might argue, in any coherent framework, what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives? And by our instruments, we don't just mean the way that we thought about it 30 years ago about setting the policy rate, but using the opportunity when you have fixed action dates to describe when you're setting that policy rate what monetary policy is, which is a commitment to adjusting the policy rate over time sufficiently aggressively to provide an anchor for inflation and inflation expectations. Back then, and what New Zealand, I visited there because they invited me there after I moved to the IMF, having developed the framework at the Bank of Canada, was to introduce them to a framework that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand then invested in. And by 1998, this is like 8 years after they'd actually announced inflation targeting, they gave birth to what is known as the forecasting and policy analysis system. And so this took a big investment, as it did in many, many other central banks that developed FPAS Mark 1. FPAS Mark 1 was about thinking about baseline forecasts using the central bank's forecast as an ideal intermediate target. In other words, using the inflation forecast to come up with a path for steering inflation back to the target in a way that efficiently managed the short run output inflation trade-off, or for some central banks that express the dual mandate in terms of full employment, managing the short run trade-off between inflation and, say, unemployment or employment objectives and so on. So what happened? Many central banks, in fact, the majority of central banks, the majority of central banks that were doing inflation targeting were developing frameworks to do what we could describe as Mark 1, or that version of inflation targeting that New Zealand first introduced in 1998, where they published the path of the policy rate and everything else that went into the forecast. The problem with that, as has been emphasized, is that when you're facing periods of things like stagflationary shocks, like COVID and so on, and all the uncertainty that central banks have been facing, is to think more in terms of scenarios-based forward guidance. So this is the latest initiative of the Central Bank of Armenia, The ideas behind this framework were first launched in a working paper by Chang-Yong Rhee and I. This is Governor Rhee at the Bank of Korea at a Jackson Hole um, presentation in the summer of 2022. And then the Central Bank of Armenia started working out the ideas about how to do this in a working paper by Governor Galstian and myself in October 2022. And after about 15 months, they had developed the second generation of forecasting and policy analysis systems. Governor Wallace, when he was at a conference in Korea a few weeks ago, described the Central Bank of Armenia as being the new New Zealand, and so on. So in that framework, okay, one develops these different scenarios. One is a case A scenario where or the policy rate has to be higher. In other words, there's more inflationary pressures in the economy. So the path of the expected policy rate has to be higher than what's currently priced in financial markets. And a case B scenario where inflationary forces are less. And as a result of that, and potentially recessionary forces are stronger. So in that case B scenario, the expected path of policy rate has to be lower than what's currently priced in financial markets. So it's very similar to Governor Powell's speech last Wednesday when they announced that they weren't changing the policy rate. Well, effectively, where Jay Powell basically said that the baseline is virtually meaningless. It's just numbers that they're penciling in, and that they all have worries about case A kinds of scenarios where tariff could end up being higher, and more importantly, the effects of tariffs on inflation could end up being more problematic. In other words, bigger and more persistent inflationary forces. And then there's case B scenarios where they would be concerned about maybe the labor market tightening faster than what was currently priced in financial markets. So the big question that many people are asking is can we describe, after we've constructed things like these case A and these case B scenarios, can we describe where they fit into the probability distribution? And this is where today's talk hopefully will ask: is there a better way, or a more structured way of trying to quantify where these judgmental scenarios or scenarios produced by some people, maybe using a model to help impose some macroeconomic consistency, is there a more structured way of doing that? And that's what today's seminar is about. So Matteo has been working with people at the IMF, Tobias Adrian and various co-authors. And so he's going to take us through now that presentation in the next 30 minutes. And then we have Charles Goodhart and Martin Weale, both who are former members of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England, who will then provide some discussion, and then we'll open it up to other people that are attending the seminar. So please, can you start?
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you for the very nice introduction. I am sharing the slide. Let me know in case you don't see them. And all right, good. So this is a joint work with Tobias and Domenico and Mike. And of course, whatever I'm gonna say today, it's our opinion and does not reflect the opinion of the Federal Reserve or the IMF. So this paper is about basically how to communicate, how central banks communicate macroeconomic risks, both to the outside public and internally. And this has been historically done in two different ways. One is through the use of narrative scenarios, and the other one is through the use of full predictive distributions. Now, narrative scenarios is the preferred way. No, narrative scenario is the preferred way of communicating risk internally at the Federal Reserve, and they have been featuring in the Teal book since 1995. I believe that probably all of you knows it, but in case someone of you don't, the Teal book is the report that the Federal Reserve Board staff prepares for every FOMC. And this report includes several different pieces of information, starting with detailed description of a set of assumptions based upon which it's developed a baseline forecast. So the chart that you see on the left is taken is a snapshot from the December 2018 Teal book, and you see that the black line is the baseline forecast with confidence bands around it given by these gray shaded areas. There is a
Matteo, I'm sorry. Still on the screen right now is your first slide. Okay, so I think when you go into Zoom, you have to make sure that you've been in the presentation just before you hit the share button, and you have to hit the first window. Okay, and then that way your presentation will be dynamic, but you're still stuck in the first slide on my screen.
So on title, I'm stop on the title.
So you start sharing, okay, and then
okay, let me do this. I'll do it the hard way. Now you'll see it, right?
yeah, now I can see it, but just make sure that when you change slides,
yeah,
that we can see it.
Okay, good. So this is so the black line, as I was saying, is the Teal book forecast with the gray areas around them that are the confidence bands. This is described. This forecast is described in. There is a whole chapter about this forecast. And then there is another chapter that is called Risks and Uncertainties that deals about the uncertainty around this forecast. And most of this discussion is centered around these alternative scenarios, which are basically forecast based on a different set of assumptions. So, for example, here in this chart on the left, you see the yellow line, and the yellow line is based on the assumption that a financial-based recession will occur within 3-4 quarters from the jumping off period. And you have a whole chapter in which all these scenarios are described and presented as alternative. If there is a stronger supply side, there is an upside, and so on. And this has been done, since 1995. The alternative way that has been used is based on full predictive distributions. The full predictive distribution has been pioneered by the Bank of England, which in the mid-90s started producing these fun charts. So the chart that, if everything went fine, you should see is a snapshot that I took from a 1996 report of the Bank of England, in which they show this forecast of inflation, representing it through a probability distribution, where the darker is the color in the shaded area, the more you are through the center of the distribution. This idea of showing predictive distribution has been received like a revival in the second half of the 2010s, thanks to the work of Tobias Adrian, Domenico Giannone, and Nina Boyarshenko, who suggested using quantile regressions to produce distribution of, in particular, growth, GDP growth. The New York Fed now publishes this quantile regression, the results from the quantile regressions, in a website, in a page of the New York Fed website called Outlook at Risks. This is a snapshot that I took a couple of months ago from their website, and it is the 1 year ahead distribution forecast, a prediction of the distribution of real GDP growth. Okay, you see, this is all the numbers in the past. You see the different lines that represent different percentiles of the distribution, with the black line that is the realized GDP growth. Now, this quantile regression is an approach also taken at the Federal Reserve, and then it can be found also in the Teal book. If you go through the risks and uncertainty sections, there is a full exhibit, a full page about that is called time varying macroeconomic risks that start featuring since 2017. And it's about the distribution of the forecast error, the conditional distribution of the forecast error in the Teal book for GDP growth, that is represented here on the slide, inflation, and the unemployment rate. So this has been generically the way central banks have talked about risk: narrative scenarios and predictive distribution. Now, if you think about it,
Matteo,
yes.
I'm incredibly confused right now, okay? Because you're mixing apples and oranges and so on. So I just want to make sure that we understand what it is you're presenting. When you present the Bank of England, I'm wondering where monetary policy is in the charts. The Bank of England fan charts, there's no monetary policy. In other words, it's either the market interest rate or a flat interest rate path. And so that's completely different than I think than what the Fed is doing in terms of their lines, because they would have an endogenous path for the interest rate. So you simply can't compare what the Bank of England's doing because there's no monetary policy in it. There's no coherence in any way whatsoever. So
Right.
I'd like to explain more details about that for the audience, because you can't say that they're similar in any respect whatsoever. That's one thing. Second, it's really, really important, I think, for the audience to understand how the Fed actually constructs all those various paths, because that is not very well understood either. They have a rule called the Don-Quone rule that no model shall be used to create the baseline. And after they create the baseline, then they bring in Furbis to effectively construct the shocks that are consistent with that judgmental baseline that is constructed by the staff. And then from that, they can construct then using a model with monetary policy assumptions, in other words, a Taylor type of rule. So you're mixing apples and oranges. I can't see any connection whatsoever between what the Bank of England does with those fan charts and what the Fed and other central banks are doing when they have monetary policy integrated into the framework. Go back to the Bank of England charts, for example, okay? Please.
Yeah. So
the distribution of where inflation goes should depend on is monetary policy
100%.
Responding aggressively and so on and so forth. So I found your presentation a little confusing, to tell you the truth.
All right. They are two different objects. So one is essentially model-based object, coherently consistent. Okay, and it's the scenarios. You have a baseline, you have a story that is described according to a different set of assumptions, and you construct the forecast. That's a scenario. The other story is the predictive distribution, that is a statistical object. There is no economics in it. It's just the constellation of all possible values that a variable can take X steps ahead from now. Take GDP growth 1 year from today. Of course, whatever is going to happen to GDP growth 1 year from today, it depends on a zillion of aspects. And if you were to do scenario, you were conditioning potentially on different path of policy assumptions. And that's one way to represent your uncertainty. The other way, it's the purely statistical one that just gives you a distribution, okay? Not based on any assumption, economic assumption. It's just statistics, okay? So that's what has been proposed in the literature, started from the
Statistical distribution will come up with analysis, and historical analysis will have policy in it. So the distribution around inflation, for example, if the model is estimated over a period where the central bank has been very successful at reducing inflation uncertainty by having the framework that I'm talking about with an endogenous reaction, then the distribution will be affected by that. So I don't understand when you say, like, you're saying statistical model, and then somehow that's all we need to do to describe whether or not that object is useful or not for the purposes of what we're doing. That's what I'm failing to understand.
Right. So if you want to describe uncertainty for a variable, right? What is the uncertainty around the outcome of a given variable X period ahead from now? All you need is a statistical distribution. Potentially, right?
I need a distribution that a statistical distribution that makes sense. That's what I need. It's not what I need.
Hold on.
I need to have something that, garbage in, garbage out. I need
absolutely. Now, bear with me a moment. Give me a couple of slides, and I'm getting where you are, where you want. I believe. Okay. Now, what I was saying is the use of you all know that Ben Bernanke did a report recently of the practice of the Bank of England, and in particular he discussed how to present uncertainty around the forecast, and he criticized the use of predictive distribution, because under the argument that they are particularly difficult to communicate, and it is better to show uncertainty using scenarios and having a few simple to understand stories and represent what the outcome are around those stories. On the other hand, it's true that when the scenarios are oftentimes just narrative, and then there is no formal metric to evaluate them. Okay, it's a set of assumptions and extrapolation based on the set of assumptions. And especially the scenarios it's never attached the probability to the scenarios. And in particular, if you look at the way they are presented in the Thiel book, you don't know, and there is not a formal way of why a scenario is in or a scenario is out every Thiel book. Okay, so what we tried to do in this paper, what we wanted to do in this paper is to present a framework, okay, a Bayesian methodology that reconciles these two approaches. We want the statistical rigor of the predictive distribution and the communicative strengths of the narrative scenarios. So what we do is basically we construct the synthesis of the baseline and the alternative scenarios. So we mix them. And we mix them so that we want to have the mixing that better concord with the reference distribution. So we have a baseline, we have some scenarios, we mix them so that they match as close as possible this statistical distribution that is unconditional based on no economic assumption. Okay, and so when we do that, what we get is we get a probability, okay, for each of the scenarios represented. And we are able to say whether the scenario are enough or not to represent the uncertainty in the predictive distribution, and so to assess whether the scenario set is incomplete. And then, since we had to, we worked using published Tilbook, and the Tilbook got published with 5 years delayed, and we used only the information available to everybody. So we had to rely only on the numbers in the Tilbook, and so we had to construct, in particular, the distribution of the scenarios. And so what we have is also discussed on how to construct the scenario distribution, and as a byproduct, also how to evaluate and compare these scenarios with this baseline. Okay? Let me give you an example of what we got. So this is taken from the December 2018 Tilbook, and we focus on the forecast of GDP growth 4 quarters ahead. So for the forecast of GDP growth in 2019 Q4. The methodology, what I'm going to show you today, is applied just 4 quarters ahead and just for GDP growth, but it can be extended on more than one variable and more than one horizon. We know that it works in simulation. It does. We are working out the empirics. It's still work in progress. So you see, we have on the upper left side, we have the charts with the baseline and the scenarios. We combine them together to match the reference distribution on the upper right chart, and what we get is a distribution, a probability assigned to each of the different scenarios. So in this case, you could describe the uncertainty contained in the reference distribution by saying that the baseline, the event baseline, characterized by the path described in the upper right left chart, has a 64% probability. There is a 4% probability of an upside and a combined 25% probability of a downside, with a 4% probability of a severe downside within this 25%. And all these scenarios are able to essentially represent 91% of all the reference uncertainty expressed in the reference distribution. So there is just a 9% scenario set incompleteness. This is a summary of the paper. Before I start going into a little bit more in the methodology, if there are any questions, this is a good time.
You haven't answered my question. Like, we need to understand that distribution doesn't make sense. Particularly, you've drawn it for GDP, but if it was drawn for inflation, is it the distribution of inflation that incorporates the assumptions about monetary policy over, say, 2018? Does it focus on the period where inflation was stable, okay, or does it incorporate the 1970s? We need to know if those distributions make sense, and to understand that, we need to know precisely how that distribution was constructed.
Right.
Okay. We need to know what's in it.
In this case,
we want to know what's in it. We can't assess whether or not anything makes any sense here whatsoever, unless we understand what's in. What are the assumptions that are in these distributions? That's what I'm confused about.
Okay. In this specific application, what we are going to use, we're going to use the output at risk from the New York Fed. So this is a quantile regression, a conditional forecast using quantile regressions 1 year ahead, based on indicators of financial condition and real activity. Okay, that's what we're going to use. The important point is that here we are not taking a stand on what is a baseline, what is a scenario, and what is the reference. I mean, we are not producing them. We are taking them from someone. So I'm 100% with you that if your reference distribution is garbage, that's it. You're done. Okay. In this case, what we are using is the output at risk. So it's a conditional quantile regression. You're on mute. Douglas, you're on mute.
I know I know what the Fed does.
Right.
I need to know what you do, and I need to know whether or not it makes sense. Like, yes, it's a quartile regression, fine.
Yeah.
But does it in what assumptions does it implicitly or explicitly embody? And because you're saying it's a statistical model, I presume that means that the assumptions about are not necessarily explicit. But I need to know, for example, does that statistical model estimated over some period of time have this idea that monetary policy has changed dramatically over the sample? In the 1970s, we had bad monetary policy. We then had a transition to better monetary policy.
So you want to know the details of growth at risks?
Well, any model, you say that it can be applied to other things like inflation, like it's just a straightforward thing. And I'm
Yeah.
saying it's anything but a straightforward thing to come up with a statistical model to think about the distribution of inflation, because that depends ultimately on what the central bank is doing. If they're trying to, stop amplifying the effects of uncertainty on the economy and start responding endogenously to, like what we're doing Mark 3, the third question, what do I need to do with my instruments to achieve my objectives? That's about trying to constrain the distribution of inflation so that people have confidence that inflation is going to stay, low and stable. And you're skipping all that stuff. You're completely ignoring that question, which you have to address, because there's no sense talking about anything until people have some confidence that that those questions are being addressed.
Right. So for sure, all the questions that you're asking are addressed in the scenarios and in the baseline, right? So those are economic models. This quantile regression, like for example, there is also work on inflation at risks, and it's basically those are quantile regression estimated. I don't remember. It depends on which model you look at on a certain a certain period, and that's conditional on some variables that gives information. Like again, I don't know better well the one on inflation. I know better the one on GDP growth, and I can tell you that what's happening on the GDP growth quantile regression. There are indicators, summary indicators of real activity and of financial conditions, and essentially what comes out is that the distribution is relatively stable around a median, except when financial conditions are tight, where there are more downside risks than where the downside risks are have particular fat tails. Okay, so that's the and on inflation, how you construct it, that's a different story. I mean, this is not about constructing those distribution. These are distribution that people construct, people look at, and we take them as they are. All right. So how we do that? So what we want to do is, again, to construct this synthesis of the baseline, the alternative scenarios that better concord with the reference. So as we said, the baseline is basically a projection based on a set of assumptions. And essentially, it's your best set of assumptions. Otherwise, you would pick up on a different baseline. The alternative scenarios are again, forecast based on some alternative assumption. There is uncertainty in the baseline. There is uncertainty in the scenarios. They all produce densities. It's not. They shouldn't be looked at as point forecast. And the reference is just all possible variable. A given variable can take h steps ahead from now. So in terms of notation,
Sorry, this is really, really important because we're not going to make any progress talking about this until we understand what we're talking about.
all
So
right.
the Fed, okay,
Yes.
Produces a baseline, okay, but it's
Correct.
entirely judgmental. It's entirely judgmental. In other words, Don
Correct.
Cohn,
Yeah.
when he was at, so in what sense is it the best? Okay, because people could be confused about that. Like
Oh,
something you construct, what is the
it's
best? Like,
it's the best in the sense that if it's chosen as a baseline, that's what they think it's the best. If you ask me, okay, suppose that you're a monetary policy maker, and suppose that I have to come to you with a forecast, right? Whatever I'm gonna give you as a baseline, it's gonna be the one that is based on the set of assumptions that I believe they are the most likely one, the best ones. Otherwise, I would give you a different
yeah,
forecast.
most likely, but they have absolutely no way. That's purely a judgment. They're just
That's
saying
purely that doesn't
this
matter.
is this is the
It's
most likely. Okay, fine.
yes,
Okay,
yeah,
good. Okay,
yeah.
good.
And
And it's
alternatives,
judgmental. No,
it's just
no zero basis, no model, nothing, no analysis. This is what I think is the most likely. Okay, good.
correct,
Got it.
correct, correct. And alternative scenarios are things that I think they could happen, but I believe that they are less likely,
Okay, good. Fantastic.
essentially. Okay, so we're gonna call P0 the baseline and PJ the alternative scenarios, and give the letter P for the reference distribution. When we say that we're going to do a synthesis, the specific synthesis that we've chosen is a very simple linear synthesis. So it's a linear pool. So we're going to assign weights to the baseline and all of the scenarios, and we're going to average them. And then we want them to better concord with the reference. Now, what we mean with concordance, as a metric, we're going to use the expected misclassification rate. So what it is, the expected misclassification rate is this formula. So let's look at this. Let's look at this at the first part. So this is the expectation. So suppose that you observe y, and this y comes from the reference distribution P. The question is, what is the probability that you're going to tell me that Y is instead coming from the distribution F, so the synthesis, so that you're going to misclassify it? So if this probability is 0, that means that once you observe Y, you know for sure that it's coming from P. If it's 0.25, it means that there is a 25% chance that you're going to misclassify it as coming from F when indeed it's coming from P. And if it's 0.5, that means that there is a 50% chance. And when there is a 50% chance that you're going to misclassify it, that means that these two distributions are exactly the same because you can't recognize them. You have no way to recognize them. So what we're going to do, we're going to try to maximize this, the weights that determine the synthesis, so that this misclassification rate is as close as possible to 0.5. And we're going to do it subject to a number of constraints. And the constraints are that, of course, all the weights have to be positive, that we want them to sum to 1, and we want the baseline to have a higher weight than the other scenarios. Now, this last constraint is mathematically not necessary. It's something that judgmentally we put, again, on the base of the idea that if I'm gonna tell you that this is my baseline, then I cannot assign it a lower probability than the other scenarios. It would be absolutely inconsistent. Then maybe if this is the case, you change what is the baseline and then you present your baseline. But that's basically the story. And you can maximize this way, and the weights you're gonna get are gonna be some maximum likelihood weights. But because from some mathematical aspects that it would be too long to discuss, this creates a lot of shrinkage. So you're gonna get a lot of alphas that are zero. So what we did, we added a prior, Dirichlet prior on these weights that essentially push just a little bit towards equal weights, and so avoids this excessive shrinkage that is just a mathematical artifact and not and nothing else. So this is the methodology. Okay, the problem is that we are not producing the baseline, we're not producing the alternative scenarios, we are not producing the reference. We are taking them from the teal book. And so the question is how we constructed them. Of course, a different story would be if I had produced them. Okay, if I had produced them, I'm done. So here there is an additional step. So let's start and let's look at this case of the December 2018 teal book. And let's start with the reference. All the information that I have from the New York Fed website is this 5 percentile for the 1 year ahead forecast of GDP growth in 2018. Okay. And so what we did, we fit a skew-T distribution on these percentiles. Okay. And what we get is this chart over here. So very fat tail, 3 degrees of freedom distribution for the forecast of GDP growth 1 year from today. And then we have to get the distribution for the baseline. And in the teal book, what we have, they show both the 70% and the 90% confidence interval, but they provide the numbers just for the 50 for the 15 and 85 percentiles, so for the 70% confidence interval. And so we decided to fit a skew-T distribution, fixing the degrees of freedom to 50.
How did they create their distributions?
Right. So these are based on simulation from Furbus.
So those that's like stochastic simulations. What
Correct.
do you mean by that?
Correct.
So
That's what.
So they have monetary policy in there.
Yeah.
And they're taking a complete macro model and applying a bunch of shocks to it. Not what you're doing, which is just estimating these quartile regressions. Okay, they've got a complete macroeconomic story in these distributions.
Absolutely,
okay,
conditional on the staff baseline. Yes. So they
baseline as well as the model of the economy. Okay,
100%, 100%,
which has monetary policy in it. Yours doesn't have monetary policy in it, or it's not explicit. In theirs, it's explicit. Correct?
Correct. And in fact, they are two different objects. And we are treating them separately.
Okay, so this is you need to understand this 100% to understand what's going on here. And
suppose you have 3 assumptions on monetary policy. Okay. One is I'm gonna stay flat. Another one is I'm gonna increase the interest rate a little bit. Another one is I'm gonna decrease a little bit. In the world of today, it could be it keeps going as it's going in the US, or instead the question is, will we have problems first on inflation on the labor market? And depending on which is the case, you're gonna increase, decrease. Okay. Suppose you have these 3 and you have 3 forecasts for these 3 cases. They are all internally consistent or precisely based on a conditional on a set of a response of monetary policy. Perfect. We know what they are, these objects. In this paper, they would be a baseline, scenario 1 and scenario 2. And we want to, and that's question number one. Question number two is what is the distribution of GDP growth 1 year from today, unconditional? Not conditioning on any kind of response. Just from a statistical perspective, you look at all the possible value that it has got of the distribution of year-over-year growth in history, and you take that as your unconditional distribution. You're on mute.
You just mentioned the word history. I need to know what history, what precise history are you talking about? Like,
honestly, I admit that I don't remember what is the precise forecast, how it's constructed, what is the sample of. I can figure it out very, very easily, I believe.
But that is the most important piece of information for us, because that once we understand that, then we'll have some idea of what is in that distribution and if it's applicable to the situation that we're dealing with in maybe December 2018. What would be the appropriate sample that would the historical distribution that I say might be appropriate for creating a distribution that would be relevant for December 2018. But that could change, like when I hit COVID, and I get hit with a shock that's completely unrelated to the historical distribution and stuff. So that's what I'm, because you seem to be very positive, saying, yeah, we just use this statistical distribution. Of course, that's true, but
Correct.
only if that statistical distribution makes any sense whatsoever for the environment that we're currently dealing with. Okay, and that's where I'm, you seem to be completely skating over those I would say that what are the most relevant issues for addressing whether or not this makes sense or not.
Right. That's a good question. So I think that we agree, but we are not getting in sync. Let me try this way
Good. Thank you.
To put it this way. Again, suppose that I sit in front, Douglas is the policymaker, Matteo is the analyst, and Matteo has to present you a specific conditional distribution. In that case, I would sit in front of you and tell you specifically what I took. And if you don't agree, we would probably start iterating and finding the right sample and the right methodology to describe this story. Okay? The perspective that we took on this paper is the New York Fed is publishing that stuff. We take it as good. We also, the Federal Reserve is also publishing it in the Teal book, and we have example in the Teal book that I'm not going to show you today. It's in the paper with that distribution. If they are publishing, they believe that it's good. We are not taking the stand of judging whether that is good or not. They are publishing, we are going to take it. We are just showing our methodology applied on that. So there are two aspects. One is how you create these single objects. And we are taking them, not creating them. Okay, that's an argument how you have to do it. That's a different story. And the other one is how you play with them. So suppose that I give you a statistical distribution that you believe. Okay, we agreed on the statistical distribution. We agreed on the set of assumption of the baseline and on the different scenarios. What we are doing, we are combining these three objects, assumption and the baseline and two scenarios that are based on economic assumption, with this statistical object to get probabilities for these three objects. That's it. That's all we're doing.
Okay, I got it.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks for the questions. I mean, it's always good. All right. So we do this. we have these numbers. We just fit this, skewed distribution with 50 degrees of freedom. Essentially, we are pushing it to normal. We are assuming that it's a normal. Pretty much that's going to be good. Okay, and we get this black line. Okay, so we are going to compare this black line with this dashed line. And then we have the scenarios, okay? For the scenarios, and this is again the chart that I showed you before, all the information that we have, it's a point forecast. So that's all that is given in the book. But we need densities, okay? And so to construct the densities of these scenarios, what we did, we tilted the baseline distribution towards those scenarios to match the median using entropic tilting. Okay, so essentially called Back-Leiber distance criteria. And once we do that, we got this the full distribution for these scenarios and also the percentile represented in this table. And we also went a step further and we said, okay, so suppose that we want to add a scenario that is a purely like kind of a flat scenario, like you don't know what's going to happen, that we call the backstop scenario. Okay, and this backstop is centered in the middle of the distribution of all the scenarios, and it has percentile that are on the farthest end of the tail, on the lower and the upper tail. The inclusion of the backstop is just a choice. It's not necessary. It's a statistical way. It's a purely statistical approach of saying it's kind of a flat prior, if you wish. From a Bayesian perspective, it's the one when you don't trust any of your model, what would you do? That's basically the thing. But it's something not necessarily necessary to have there. Okay. So where we are here, we have the reference distribution, this dashed line. The baseline is the continuous line, and then you see some diamonds on the black line, which are the scenarios represented on the baseline densities. Indeed, we have a distribution for each of these diamonds. And so what we want to do, we want to synthesize the black line and the dots and their distribution to get as close as possible to the dashed line. And once we do it, this is what we obtain. So the blue bars on the back are is the histogram of the reference distribution. So we simulated from the reference distribution, and the maroon bars are the histogram of the synthesis, and you can see how well it is matching the reference distribution. In numbers, I would say, so here on this table summarize all the results. There is a lot of numbers down here. What we are interested in is in the last row that gives us, in particular, there are two numbers, 90.29 and 0.48. So 0.48 is the expected misclassification rate of the synthesis for the reference. So remember that the maximum is 0.5. The number on its left, which is 90.9, is the expected sample size. So this is a measure of coming from important sampling, and it's a measure that goes from 0 to 100, and it's related to EMR, to the expected misclassification rate. And this is what we use to give scenario setting completeness. You remember that I told you that 91% that we were able to explain 91% of the reference, and so that scenario setting completeness was 9%.
Can you try to explain this in English, please? Okay, just plain old fashioned English, no numbers, no math, or anything like that.
Okay.
So I'm facing a situation where I've estimated a statistical distribution over a particular sample. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Something arrives like COVID. I mean, something interesting has to arrive. If something happens that's like the historical distribution, you might say it's uninteresting. Okay, but something interesting arrives like COVID and so on. So when we ask when COVID arrives, that's completely unlike the statistical distribution. What do we mean by this? And so by forecast is completely like unlike the historical distribution. So what is this concept of what is this concept of asking uh, scenario synthesis? So uh, that's what I don't understand. Like to go back to your math, like the math that's based on this. So what happens when none of my statistical distributions really provide much information about the situation I'm in today?
All right. So so this is, first of all, let's take the case of COVID. No, when COVID arrives, um, so COVID arrived, and we got the first crazy number. It was Q2, if I remember correctly, or yeah, Q2. Okay, and then correct. So you have to redo your reference distribution, essentially. You have to change your distribution.
So I'd have to do that in, at all points that are basically really interesting for policy, because if it was just the same distribution that would be appropriate for history, it would be kind of uninteresting,
Right.
right?
Okay. So
It's
what
only
what
going to be interesting when something new
absolutely
changes. Global financial crisis,
right.
the effect of lower bound,
Okay.
uh,
All right. Let me go one
COVID.
step back. Let me go one step back. For example, and this is what the quantile regression are for. And this is a result that I mentioned before for GDP growth, right? From GDP growth, what they show is that the distribution is essentially very stable, except in some situations, okay? When financial conditions are tight, okay? And so, normally financial conditions are tight before recessions. So once you are in a recession, normally once you go down, you go up. So the question is, are you able to get information for future outcome in advance? Now, of course, for COVID, you weren't able, and that's okay. That's no one would have been able. But for this financial for recession, you are. So there is that's why you if you want, you can take the unconditional distribution in the past, and that's why people find it more interesting this conditional quantile regression to characterize for quarters ahead distribution. I don't remember what is
Like
the result for
during
inflation.
COVID, between kind of the last week of February and the end of March, the sky was falling. The distributions, at that point, it depends on what you mean by an unconditional distribution. But if I was thinking about just focusing my sample on periods that have COVID, I would say there's a massive uncertainty in the economy. The distribution before that just wasn't relevant because it did not have any COVID like events. So effectively, I'm talking about regime changes. I'm trying to motivate that on the basis of GDP, but much more importantly, is inflation, because we
Correct.
know there
There
were
are two
regime
states.
changes, and I'm
Yeah.
trying to understand. I'm trying to understand because you keep saying that the statistical model is useful, but you do nothing to motivate why it might be even relevant or useful for periods that are actually interesting for monetary policy. Because it seems like sometimes when the methodology would work, it would be totally uninteresting, but it would work. But in times where it's actually interesting, where there's something like COVID or what's going on now with tariffs that haven't been observed in your historical estimated statistical model, they're just not there. And so therefore, you know, it seems to me that much better methodology would be to try to have a complete macro framework for assessing these things, not some one methodology that's statistical and one methodology that's judgmental, but an integrated macro framework that could come up with a multivariate distribution of these things. I mean, that surely has got to be the way to do that. And to do that would be very complicated. Nobody's done that before.
Right. So the question is, so what we are basically, so think about it. When you have in mind your micro framework, okay, you have in mind the model of the economy and some set of assumptions. So that's gonna be your baseline, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, so if your baseline describes perfectly all the risks out there, first of all, you are basically done. And what you can do in terms of alternative scenarios is if you want to compare point forecast, doing just odds ratio based on the distribution of your baseline, or you can look at how different are the scenarios in terms of your baseline using the expected misclassification rate one-on-one. And maybe, if you want, answering the following question, which is how to combine your scenarios to give you back your baseline. And basically, so we are taking as a reference point this statistical distribution, okay? We believe that it's more dispersed than the baseline or than the alternative scenarios. This is basically what happens, okay? If instead you don't believe in the statistical distribution and you believe that the baseline is the correct representation of the world, then you can work out our analysis exactly the same way, substituting the baseline for the reference, but the meaning is gonna be different. And then what you're gonna get is the weights for the scenario that gives you back your baseline. So if we go back to the example that we were discussing before, it's today, okay? Today, baseline, everything goes fine. Number one, we have problem in the labor market first. Number two, we have problem in the inflation world first. So increase, decrease interest rates. Okay, if you believe that your baseline is the best representation of what is out there, okay, and then you're gonna get the combination of these two scenarios, I increase, I decrease, that gives you back this one. What we are adding is another layer, which is based on known assumption, we draw a distribution. Of course, if there is a regime change that we have never observed in history 1 year from today, or in the meantime from today, or 1 year from now, we're gonna miss it. That's unavoidable, right? But in this way, we're gonna give a weight to these three objects, and that's basically what is done in this table. That is telling the weight. It's the last column on the right of each of the scenarios and the baseline, and the numbers that describe how much they concord with the reference distribution. In the case of the December Teal book, given the information that were public, that are available to the public. Okay. And to show you another example, just to say that things get different, we went, for example, back to the case of December 2007. At the time, the quantile regression stuff was not available, but you know, we can look at it ex post, and we did all the same machinery, the same thing that I've explained. you see that the dashed line, it's a very, very dispersed forecast, okay? And including numbers below -2%, which is what actually come out in that quarter, in the fourth quarter of 2008. You see that at the time, the scenarios were all very concentrated towards the center of the baseline distribution, and there was just a credit crunch scenario, which was expecting a slightly less than 0% growth. And if you do this combination, if you apply the same methodology, what you get is this chart, and you see that there is a lot of part of the reference distribution that is not covered. And in numbers, you see in particular this 0.43 last row. Okay, it's the expected misclassification rate. So how well are you matching the reference? 71% in terms of expected sample size, so 30% incomplete, and the weight to the different scenarios, last column on the right, and you see that the baseline mathematically, I mean, this is a rounding issue, still has the highest weight, but it's very much closer to all the other events. How am I doing on time? Oh, I have to finish. So basically,
well, we'll get over and Martin and Charles. They've been lined up to provide commentary and so on. I'm trying to make sure that we understand, that we all understand what is going on here. But so if you could wrap up, and then maybe we could get Charles and Martin's responses to this, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I presented is basically a Bayesian methodology to reconcile predictive distribution and alternative scenarios. And this methodology gives us essentially the probability of each scenarios and how well this scenario match the uncertainty out there. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Matteo. So, Charles, maybe you could stop sharing your screen, Matteo. But we have Charles Goodhart here, who is the person that emailed me and said that once he found your paper, Matteo, he was very, very interested in this subject matter, because he's always asking us, when we come up with these case A and case B scenarios, where do they fit inside the distribution and so on. And I always respond to Charles with a very famous quote from Alan Greenspan, where he said that we should try. This is his 2004 paper, but where he said that we should try to quantify this stuff, and then he had a comma, when it makes sense, and that is the kind of like the devil in the details and stuff. So, Charles, could you take?
Well, actually, I thought you would ask Martin to go first, and
yeah, we can make Martin go first. He's much younger, and so I'm totally happy with that.
I'm perfectly happy to, but I think you had asked Martin to go first, and so I think you ought to give him a fair run before I come in.
Martin, please.
Well, I'm perfectly happy to go first, so I'll try sharing my screen. No great optimism that I'll actually deliver what I want, but let's try.
Mr. Weale, I can also share the presentation you sent.
Well, let's see how this works.
Okay.
We can see it.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
And if
we can see the full screen.
And if I move on to the next slide, does that work?
Yes, it works.
Okay, so thank you very much, and not surprised. No, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I should say that for someone who's not an expert in the field, and to say the least, that's me, the mechanics of what's going on I found rather difficult to follow. And as I say, that reflects my lack of experience with things like entropic tilting, but I'll do my best. Anyway, I thought I'd start with the background from a UK perspective and then go on to try and show my incomplete understanding of what you've been doing. So, I adopted 1993 as the start of density forecasts at the bank, but I saw in your slides you changed that to 1996. And anyway, in the mid-90s, the Bank of England and Monetary Policy Committee started producing density forecasts, and many other bodies have followed suit. There have been periodic criticisms of the Monetary Policy Committee for not producing alternative scenarios. And in about 2015, I think it was Kevin Walsh's report on the bank suggested making use of scenarios. And at first it was clear what scenario we should look at. Supposing productivity growth improved, went back closer to normal, wouldn't that be wonderful? And the scenario showed that it was wonderful. But after a second scenario that was something to do with trade, we found it difficult to think of key issues that were worth illustrating by scenarios, and they rather faded out because there was only a small number of clear alternatives that we thought were of interest. Ben Bernanke, however, suggested in his review of forecasting that scenarios would be useful, that they would help people understand the Monetary Policy Committee's reaction function, raising the question, is there a clear reaction function from the Monetary Policy Committee? And Bernanke also suggested that fan charts should be, as he put it, eliminated. He didn't quite say exterminated, but he did seem to be treating them a bit like an infestation of insects or something like that, which certainly isn't the way that I've seen them. So what you aim to do, as I understand it, in contrast to Bernanke's suggestion, and much more productively, is to integrate scenarios and fan charts using a Bayesian framework. And the point you make, which is certainly true of the limited number of scenarios that the bank has started to produce, is that they usually don't come with either distributions conditional on scenarios or with the probability of realization of the scenario. And that perhaps is relevant, although we didn't produce a scenario of what would happen if the euro area had collapsed in 2013, we started to think that there was a more than 10% probability of that happening, and puzzled for a bit over how to show that in the fan charts. The fan charts, I should mention, arguably, and the bank is slightly vague on this, but arguably they describe only the distribution of the central 90%. They take no view on the distribution of the outer 10% of shocks. And that, of course, matters quite a lot if you're calibrating the fan charts to past data and you have something like the COVID shock, which you might say is a 1 in 50-year shock, 1 in 100-year shock, but certainly not a 1 in 10-year shock. Anyway, so the problem you have to address is that the scenarios are rather incomplete, and you show how to construct distributions for the scenarios using entropic tilting, and the final distribution that you attribute to the scenario, as I understand it, is as close as possible to the baseline distribution using the Kuhlbach-Leibniz criterion. So that's where I've got to so far. What do you use as inputs? Well, so first of all, a baseline forecast with probability distribution. Secondly, scenarios without any distribution. And then this reference predictive density. And to pick up on the discussion that you and Doug had during your presentation, the predictive density is obviously conditional on some sort of policy framework. I think that's something that Bob Lucas taught us, but if the policy framework changes, then you might expect that the past statistical distribution would be rather poor. And of course, that brings one into the question of the period 1997 to 2008. Was that a period when things were unusually stable, or was it the policy framework that was delivering greater stability? At the time, I think people were perhaps a bit too keen to attribute it to the policy framework, but one or the other, history does come in different slices, and structural changes, whether they're induced by policy framework or for some other reason, cause problems with any attempt to learn from the past. On the other hand, people tend to think that the past has changed more than they have. Now, I puzzled the reference distribution you generated from a statistical forecast, but I think you could probably base it also on past forecast errors. I'd be glad to know your thoughts on that. The backstop distribution, I'm afraid, did leave me rather confused. You did clarify it a bit in your presentation, that it was, as you said, like a flat Bayesian prior. There are presumably other distributions that one could choose that would be even flatter, but I think you did clarify the role, at least to some extent, in the presentation. So what questions do I wonder about? Would it matter, and I'm not sure whether the answer to this is yes or no, would it matter if you had a distribution, which I think is quite realistic, that the central 90% may be, say, a skewed t distribution, and then you have very dispersed data in the outer 10%. The outer 10% needn't, of course, be symmetric between the upper part of the distribution and the lower distribution. You may have, even with a plausible t distribution, much more extreme values than the skewed t distribution could generate, even with 2 degrees of freedom, say. So does it matter if the extreme values are very extreme, as they were during the COVID period? Then I had a question about your figure 2, some of the densities, and you showed us one in your presentation, some of the densities have very odd shapes. Is that because of the tilt before the scenario, before tilting, the scenario is assumed to be median, conditional on the scenario, and is it that even with low weights creates the near discontinuity in the density function? You had some that looked as though there were steps in them, and I wasn't sure quite how to interpret them. But anyway, my final thought, I should say, or apologize first of all, that for someone who's not up in the literature, this wasn't an easy paper to follow, but it is certainly a very valuable step to produce a synthesis of fan charts and scenarios that I think these would be quite useful in policy making, whether people in 2007, looking at the probability you attributed to a greater housing correction, which I think was extremely low, yes. Would people have looked at that and thought they ought to change their baseline forecast? I suspect they might. So I think this framework can help policymakers or forecasters, whether the forecast is produced by bank staff or the Monetary Policy Committee. This sort of framework can help policymakers think about their forecasts, both in terms of the reference of the baseline forecast and in terms of the distribution attached to it. And I should wind up, well, my penultimate comment should be that, of course, this is a much more positive approach to fan charts than elimination of them. But finally, I should thank you for a paper which opened my eyes to what to me is a new literature. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments.
So Charles, Okay. The question is, should Matteo respond to those, or would you like to go now, Charles? It's up to you.
Question for you, Matteo. You want to respond to Martin, or wait for me to make a few comments too?
You can go ahead. I mean, which one? I have took notes and I'm ready to respond, but we can move. Whichever is better for timing. I'm fine either way.
Charles, please.
Okay, fair enough. Let me start. I'm afraid I haven't been able to do slides the way that Martin has. I'm less good at that. Let me start by saying that the baseline initially with the fan chart, the main problem was that nobody took much notice of the fan chart. And it's also the case that as Doug said, there was no endogeneity of policy as a result. But basically, nobody took any notice, and there was much too much weight placed on the central baseline forecast in a world in which we're very uncertain. And it was really for that reason that there's been a move towards scenarios. I think that move is a good move in many ways. My concern, I've got a number of concerns. One is that the number of scenarios that you could potentially have is virtually infinite. And I had rather hoped when I first looked at your paper that you were going to tell us which scenarios we ought to use. But I think that you're not doing that. In section 4 of your paper, the empirical bit, you simply take the scenarios that the Teal book actually had. And as I understand it, what you're doing is you're using your model to try to assess the probability of each scenario, or the alpha or the ET or whatever. I'm not quite certain. Like Martin, I found the earlier mathematical, theoretical bits very difficult. I'd never heard of entropic tilting before, and I have no understanding what the hell entropic tilting actually means. And as for your Coolbeck, whatever it is, formula, let me I'd never heard of that either. So there's a lot in there that I found quite difficult. But going to your approach, using your model to assess the probability of the various scenarios, okay. But I think there are a couple of things. First, and perhaps most important, we don't necessarily know quite how the shocks work, and whether your reference model gets it correctly, I don't know. And I'm particularly concerned in all of this, which is an area that I know that Doug is also concerned with, the endogeneity of central bank response. Let me put it this way, and then give you an example. If the central banks know immediately which shock is occurring and can respond instantaneously, then effectively you're going to be able to smooth virtually everything out. One of the problems is we don't know which shock is going to occur, and when it does occur, we don't know how it's going to work through. Let me give you two very recent examples. In 2021, 2022, we had an energy shock. And one of the great questions was that shock going to be transitory or permanent? And the central banks are now accused of having been too slow, because they thought it was going to be transitory. It turned out to be much more permanent. And again, they depended very much on the assumption that they thought expectations firmly anchored, anything like an energy shock would be very transitory and temporary. We've got exactly the same thing happening now. It's not a question of the probability of a tariff shock occurring. The much more difficult question in many ways is, would that tariff shock be temporary or permanent? And that's what's dividing the Fed at the moment. Those who think that a tariff shock will disappear within about a year, and those who think it won't. To a large extent, this again is dependent on this expectations stuff. And there's a very interesting paper, which Matteo, you and you lot ought to read as all central bankers, by Koibion and Goronchenko, who effectively say that the expectations that matter, which are the expectations of the firms 1 year out, have never been anchored. So that the central banks have actually got it wrong. So the question of the endogeneity of central banks is, I think, absolutely crucial. And it's never, as far as I can make out, cut in your paper at all. As I understand it, and I'm probably wrong, your paper is really trying to get to the sort of question of what is the probability, given your model, of these shocks occurring. I think it's the much more interesting issue is, what is the response when you find the shock, and when do you actually, are you certain that the shock has occurred? And then let me sort of come to another point. The key issue, or key issues, are twofold. How do central bankers, how should they make a decision, and how can they communicate it to the world? Now, if I look at your table 6, oil table 4, you've got the distributions of these various shocks, and you've got a massive great table. If I was a central banker and I looked at that table 6 or table 4, I don't think I'd feel any the wiser. And I don't know how you would communicate it to a wider public to inform them about the difficulties. And if I was to try and make a change to the way that the world and sort of forecasting all this work, I think I would try and do it in terms of how could you present the risks and the issues to the central bankers in such a way that it would minimize their potential regret. And again, I don't think you do that. So, and how do you believe that your presentation actually helps communication to a non-technical public? You know, Martin at least, I think, knows what entropic tilting means. I don't. But if we don't understand it, what the hell do you think Mrs. Smith down at the grocer's shop is going to make of it? How are you going to communicate this to the public? And remember, it's quite largely a communication issue. And I think that's enough for me.
Well, it's kind of amusing, Charles, because Matteo, thank you so much for doing research in this area. I'm very pleased about that. I have been working on this stuff for decades, and Charles is going to be really happy because what we came up with was Latin hypercube sampling, okay, which is like when you have a fully nonlinear macro model, how do you sample the space that's relevant, especially when you have kinks like the effective lower bound or confidence crisis. And what I discovered after doing that research at the Bank of Canada, and we released a paper in just before the global financial crisis. It was a bit embarrassing, actually, because the GFC hit, and all these journalists wanted to ask me about what was Latin hypercube sampling. And the bottom line was sampling the relevant parts of the distribution where those nonlinearities were really important. Now, what I discovered, Charles, working with the smartest economists in the world, is that none of us could really understand distributions. Like, I'm talking about, people like Maury Opsfeld and Olivier Blanchard. They just couldn't wrap their minds around multivariate nonlinear distributions. That's very, we just couldn't do it and stuff. We tried to do it. So Matteo, you might want to go back to a paper on Latin hypercube sampling and that we published just before the global financial crisis in 2008 that talked about all these issues. And the paper is impenetrable because most people, that's an extremely complicated area. But please, Matteo, can you please try to respond to all the various questions that you have today?
Let me start with I'll move backwards essentially. So thanks to Charles and Martin for their comments, and Charles went a couple of steps ahead actually, in the sense that the paper that we wrote is undoubtedly a technical paper, is a statistical paper, essentially aiming at presenting the methodology from a formal point of view. We are working on a more accessible version for policymakers. So, of course, I wouldn't. That's too technical for sure for policymakers to communicate that way. And the way I would communicate the table is essentially giving the information that I gave in my third slide, which is what is the probability assigned to each of these events, baseline the scenarios, and that's it. The scenario setting completeness is something between people working, in my opinion. There are a couple of aspects that have been touched. So Charles was mentioning the number of the scenarios is infinite, and we are not saying anything about which scenarios to present. It's true. And at the same time, Martin was mentioning the possibility of changing the baseline once you see the analysis. We were discussing about this with Tobias, Domenico, and Mike, and we took the approach of this is the deal book. We'll show you what one could do with what you did. Period. I don't think that it's not necessarily clear whether those are the scenarios you want to show to the public, for example. You may, this is a whole discussion that one should have. Do you want to be that specific in calling an upside greater supply side, or do you want to synthesize it somehow? In terms of the number of scenarios, our analysis produces metrics that essentially gives you an idea of which one are useful, conditional on which other ones you have. Okay, so while you apply this methodology, you understand what's going on and if there are information that is redundant or not. We are not doing it, not in this paper. Probably it's the stance that we're going to take in the more policy-oriented paper, in which say this is how we would do it. Okay, this time we anchored on what is out there. It's more, to gain trust from people. We use what was available there. Interesting, Charles, you mentioned the story of what's going on. Like you made the example today of what if the outcome on inflation crucially depends on whether the shock will be transitory or not. And in this sense, what we call reference distribution it's a combination of both. So ex ante, you don't know it. So what is all the possible values that inflation can take, whether it comes out that the shock is transitory or not? Okay, and that's the idea. That's the distribution. Of course, if you are going to construct your reference assuming that it's transitory and then it happens to be non-transitory, it's a big problem. Once I constructed some scenarios, calibrating using the inflation distribution in the last 20 years or so, before COVID, when it was stable, and that were absolutely useless in terms of what happened after COVID when we had a regime shift. So that is absolutely clear. So your reference distribution has to be broad. You mentioned entropic tilting, and as well Martin mentioned entropic tilting. Entropic tilting is this idea: if you have a distribution, how can you and you want to modify this distribution in some aspects, and in the case that we're using is we want to change the median of this distribution, how you have to change what is the minimal modification to this distribution that you have applied to match the percentile that you are targeting. And the question of Martin on the odds shape is because of the tilting, 100%, is because we are tilting and we are imposing a constraint on the median. If the constraint was, for example, on the mean, that would have implied a pure shift on that distribution. Again, the fact that we are doing this entropic tilting is just a question that we don't have it. We don't have those distribution. The tilt book doesn't publish it. If we had it, we would have not had to do that analysis. Martin mentioned the possibility of having a reference based on past forecast error. Absolutely, it's another option. It's what it's in the tilt book. Because they use normal distribution to generate those distribution, it's less interesting when you apply our analysis. It's in the paper, but it's less interesting. The backstop is a statistical thing coming from the Bayesian synthesis analysis. And here is basically Bayesian synthesis analysis is the perspective of a Bayesian decision maker that has to choose between different options, the baseline and the other scenarios. And the question is, what if you don't trust any of these? And so what is the alternative that you should have? And if these were forecast, if you don't trust any of these, probably your backstop would have been like the mean of the process or the last observation, something like that, with a super flat distribution. So that's the idea that we wanted to I mean, this is the backstop as a function in terms of from a statistical point of view. But again, it's not necessary. Yeah, I would say that pretty much I've answered almost all. I heard that there is a question from the public.
Please. Can you proceed and ask your question?
May I?
Right.
Thank you, Matteo, first of all.
Please explain who you are and
I'm
your
Marek
background.
Lazaryan, board member of the Central Bank of Armenia. So, Matteo, if I understood the analysis correct, you are combining information from the Fed Tailbook with the time series, with the existing data to produce the output from the growth at risk model. So we need basically two pieces of information. One is the history, which is in the data, and then we need some information regarding the future, which comes from the Fed Tailbook. And then you produce different scenarios, including the baseline. Now, my first question, when you explain these scenarios, including the baseline with assumptions and decorate it with the story, does it match ex post at the end of the day with the assumptions in the Tailbook, or you have a break in the assumptions, which you use as an input? So do the baseline assumptions regarding the future stay in the place after you are done with the work? And by assumptions, I mean assumptions fixed in the Tailbook. Or if you are doing other approach, that's one I'll be glad to hear. And my second questions, did you try to do an out of sample evaluation analysis? Because you are saying that your baseline is the most likely scenario, and then an out of sample evaluation, again, taking into consideration the assumptions, will really make the work very robust. Thank you.
Okay, let me start from this second question, because it also will answer most of the first. We are not producing the baseline, and we're not producing the scenarios. Those are the one in the Tailbook. Now, it may be that I was the one writing the part on inflation in the December 2018 Tailbook. I don't remember if it may be, but that doesn't matter. We are taking those as they are. They are presented to the FOMC as such, and we are assuming that those are the best assumptions, because otherwise they wouldn't present that model. Whomever is going to produce you some forecast, if they tell you this is my baseline, that's the one that they believe the most. Otherwise, it would be incoherent. Now, it would be incoherent if I came to you and I'll tell you, I believe that GDP growth will be 3%, but I believe that there is a higher probability that will be 2%. So you would look at me and say, look, what is your forecast? No, I mean, that's basically the idea. In this sense, we haven't done any out of sample evaluation, so it's not. We didn't go into the business of this is our forecast and prove you that is the one that is the best one and so on. So these are the one publishes. If they publish it, we believe it. That's it. In terms of the assumption on the baseline that you see in the Tailbook, they are tweaked Tailbook to Tailbook. So if that's what they do, and they also change the scenarios. I mean, there is some persistence in the scenarios that they show, but if you look at the evolution of the different Tailbook, they sometimes change. And they essentially represent the most, normally is what they are more worried about, strictly speaking. And that's basically the idea. And they changed. I mean, they depending on what is the problem and how they want to show their uncertainty about it. I honestly haven't seen the assumption, the scenarios in the latest Tailbook, because I was on vacation, but I can imagine that there are probably a zillion of scenarios, not a zillion, there is probably one or two scenarios about tariff. Okay, that's my guess. And, you can expect that since the election, there has been a number of scenarios on tariff. And these scenarios have changed based on the evolution of what was happening. That's a very easy guess. So the assumption changes. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we're running out of time, but if there are there any more questions? Because otherwise I'll sum up and thank Matteo and Martin and Charles and Nard for all the commentary and so on. I would say, Matteo, that this deserves at least another 100 seminars that you've actually, people are really interested. Charles prompted this seminar by sending me an email saying that, we have to think about all this stuff. Martin agreed graciously and so on. So I would just like to start by thanking you, Matteo, for a wonderful presentation, and we hope to have you back and see how your research progresses in these particular areas, which are very, very, very difficult. My advice to you is to go back to our 2008 paper on Latin hypercube sampling, because in that paper, what we did is we developed a methodology for doing this in a macro context, fully Bayesian, where there's not only one model, but there's a whole family of models. And you have to kind of like search over those family of models and ask, first of all, do those models represent the reality that we're dealing with? So if we're dealing with a financial crisis, we're dealing with things like endogenous money creation and destruction. Those processes about how the seeds of a financial crisis can be sowed. And you can't just say statistical model, because statistical models tend to be linear for tractability. They're completely useless for thinking about, events that are interesting for policymakers. They care not about, if times are going to be good or not. They care about managing. I think what Charles said and Martin said about least regrets, dealing with difficult situations where previous statistical models have virtually, I wanted to say almost nothing to say, but they have something to say, but almost certainly the things that they have to say will be will be exacerbated in the sense that those macroeconomic linkages, the macro financial linkages, will definitely be much more exacerbated during periods of financial crises or financial stress and so on. But Matteo, thank you very much. And thank you to Charles and Martin and Narek for providing their commentary. And I look forward to seeing how your research with Tobias and others progresses in this area. Okay, so thanks.
Thanks a lot. It was very interesting. It was great. Thank you for the opportunity.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.